Imagine opening your front door to four
Здравствуйте.
police officers ready to cuff you for a
Мы
crime you
собираем
didn't commit
информацию об
against a
инциденте,
man you've
который
never even
произошел
heard of.
сегодня утром.
That was my Tuesday
Вы
night,
что-нибудь
a
видели?
night that began with the mundane comfort of a typical American evening. The smell of a home-cooked dinner still lingering in the air, and the soft hum of the dishwasher providing a soundtrack to what I thought was a peaceful life. I was standing in the foyer, still wearing my work clothes, when that heavy, rhythmic pounding shook the wood of the front door. It wasn't the polite knock of a neighbor or the frantic tap of a delivery driver. It was an authoritative, soul-chilling sound that signaled the end of my world as I knew it. When I pulled the door open, the cool night air rushed in, but it was instantly blocked by the dark, imposing figures of four officers, their badges catching the yellow glow of the porch light and reflecting it back with a cold, metallic indifference. Before I could even ask what was happening, the lead officer stepped forward, his voice a low, gravelly monotone as he recited a series of rites I only knew from television. My hands were pulled behind my back, and the sharp, clinical click of the steel handcuffs snapping around my wrists felt like the closing of a trap. By Wednesday morning, I realized my 12-year marriage was actually a high-stakes crime drama starring my wife as the ultimate villain. But in those first few moments, I was just a man in shock, being led down my own driveway while the rhythmic pulsing of red and blue lights painted my neighbors' houses in a strobe-like nightmare. Most guys find out about an affair through a stray text glowing on a nightstand in the dead of night, or a weird credit card receipt for a hotel in a city their spouse never should have visited. But I found out because my wife's lover told the cops I was the one who jumped him in a dark parking lot. The ride to the precinct was a blur of silence and internal screaming. The vinyl seat of the cruiser cold against my skin as I tried to process the impossible. I kept thinking about Lisa, wondering if she was inside the house crying, or if she was the one who had made the call. The processing room was a stark contrast to the warmth of my suburban home, filled with the smell of industrial floor wax and stale coffee, a place where your identity is stripped down to a set of fingerprints and a mugshot. When I was finally sat down in an interrogation room, the detective leaned across the table and threw a folder down, showing me pictures of a man named Jeremy, whose face was unrecognizable under a mask of bruises and swelling. They told me I had ambushed him at the Sundown Motel, a place I'd only ever driven past on the interstate, and that he had identified me by name as his attacker. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Jeremy wasn't just a victim. He was the man who had been sleeping in my bed, wearing my robes, and occupying the spaces of my life that I thought were sacred. My wife hadn't just betrayed our vows. She had weaponized the entire legal system to remove me from the board, choosing a path of destruction that went far beyond a simple divorce. As the detective pressed me for a confession, I felt a strange, icy calm begin to settle over my nerves, replacing the panic with a diamond-sharp focus. I realized that the woman I had loved for over a decade was a stranger who had been calculating my downfall while I was planning our next vacation. I'm going to tell you exactly how I turned being a prime suspect into a masterclass in scorched-earth revenge that left my wife jobless, friendless, and completely broke. But first, you have to understand the depth of the betrayal. They thought they had found a convenient scapegoat in a man who played by the rules, a husband who was too blinded by loyalty to see the snake in the grass. They expected me to crumble, to weep, and to beg for mercy in a system that was already tilted against me. Instead, they handed me the ultimate motivation. I sat in that plastic chair, watching the clock on the wall tick toward dawn, and I stopped being the man who built bridges and started being the man who burns them down. The anger wasn't hot. It was a sub-zero freeze that hardened my resolve to ensure that every single lie they told would eventually become the fuel for their own ruin. I knew the truth was on my side, even if it was buried under a mountain of Lisa's carefully crafted deceptions, and I was going to dig it out with surgical precision. This wasn't just about clearing my name anymore. It was about a total, absolute reclamation of my life and the systematic dismantling of the people who tried to steal it from me. As the morning sun began to bleed through the high, reinforced windows of the station, I didn't see a tragedy. I saw an opportunity for a reckoning that would leave no stone unturned and no betrayal unpunished. The game they started was about to be played by my rules, and by the time the final whistle blew, they would realize that the biggest mistake they ever made was assuming I wouldn't fight back with everything I had. Every minute I spent in that cell was a minute I spent planning, visualizing the fallout, and preparing for a war that they were nowhere near ready for. The transition from a loving husband to a cold-blooded strategist was instantaneous, a survival instinct that kicked in the moment I saw Jeremy's bloodied face and realized the trap Lisa had set. She wanted a drama, she wanted a villain, and she wanted a clean slate at my expense. But she forgot that an engineer knows exactly how to find the structural weaknesses in any foundation, even one built on 12 years of lies. I was going to find every crack, every secret, and every hidden sin, and I was going to bring the whole house down on top of her. So there I am, sitting in an interrogation room while a detective shows me pictures of a guy named Jeremy, whose face looks like a piece of tenderized steak, a gruesome mosaic of deep purples, sickly yellows, and raw, angry reds that made my stomach turn despite the cold fury rising in my chest. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a low-frequency buzz that seemed to vibrate inside my skull, casting a harsh, unforgiving glare on the metal table between us. The detective, a man whose face was etched with the weary cynicism of 20 years on the force, slid another photo toward me, this one showing Jeremy's swollen eyes and the heavy bandages wrapped around his jaw. He told me, with a voice as dry as sandpaper, that Jeremy had pointed a shaking finger at my photo and identified me as the man who had ambushed him in the pitch-black shadows of the sundown motel parking lot. It was news to me, a complete and utter fabrication that felt like watching a movie of someone else's life, especially since I'd spent that whole night surrounded by the elite of our city at the annual Metropolitan Children's Hospital Charity Gala. While Jeremy was supposedly being pummeled into the pavement, I was standing on a podium in a tailored tuxedo, shaking hands with the mayor and holding a literal time-stamped award for Structural Engineer of the Year in my hand. I had 50 witnesses, a professional photographer who had captured my every move, and a digital trail of GPS data and valet receipts that placed me 3 towns away from that seedy motel. I looked at the detective and felt a wave of dark amusement wash over me. They had built a case on the desperate lies of a man who was clearly terrified of the truth. I told the detective to check the gala's guest list, to call the hospital board, and to look at the local news coverage from the night before. But he just sat there, arms crossed, waiting for me to crack. The tension in the room was thick enough to choke on, a suffocating silence that lasted until a junior officer knocked on the door and whispered something into the detective's ear. They left me alone for what felt like hours, the ticking of the wall clock sounding like a countdown to an explosion I knew was coming. When the detective finally returned, his demeanor had shifted from aggressive predator to confused observer. He pulled a laptop from his bag and turned the screen toward me, saying that the security footage from the motel had finally been processed and synced with the time of the 911 call, The real kicker came when the security footage started rolling in, grainy and flickering with the low quality of a budget surveillance system, and it wasn't me on that tape. The man in the video was wearing a heavy work jacket and a baseball cap pulled low, but as he stepped under the flickering neon sign of the motel office, he looked directly into the camera for a split second. My heart stopped. It wasn't me. It was my brother-in-law, Mike, a man who had sat at my Thanksgiving table for a decade and toasted to our family's health. As the video played out, I watched in morbid fascination as Mike stepped out from behind a rusted dumpster and leveled Jeremy with a single, brutal swing of a wooden baseball bat. The detective began to lay out the pieces of a puzzle I hadn't even known I was solving. Apparently, Lisa had been seeing Jeremy for 7 months after meeting him as a patient at the clinic where she worked. A secret life she had built right under my nose while I was working late nights to pay for the very house she was betraying me in. She had been sneaking off to that motel, using our shared life as a shield for her infidelity, but she hadn't counted on her own brother finding out. Mike, a man obsessed with the pristine reputation of the family and their standing in our social circle, had discovered the affair weeks ago. Instead of coming to me, instead of being a man of honor, he decided to handle the situation with a baseball bat, thinking he could scare Jeremy into silence and protect the family name from the stain of Lisa's scandal. When the police had arrived at the hospital to interview Jeremy, the coward had panicked. He knew Mike was dangerous, and he knew that if he pointed the finger at his lover's brother, the retaliation would be even worse. So, he took the easy way out. He gave them my name, thinking a boring engineer wouldn't be able to fight back, and Lisa, in a move that chilled me to my core, had backed him up. She had sat in our living room and told the officers that I had been agitated and acting strangely the night of the assault, effectively trying to trade my freedom for her own secret's protection. Sitting in that room, watching the footage of Mike's rage, I realized that I was surrounded by vipers I had called family. The detective closed the laptop and sighed, the weight of the realization that they had almost ruined an innocent man's life settling over him. He apologized, though the words felt empty and small compared to the crater they had left in my world. I wasn't just cleared. I was now the primary witness in a multi-layered criminal investigation involving assault, perjury, and a conspiracy to frame an innocent man. As they processed my release, the cold calm I had felt earlier solidified into a plan. I didn't need to scream, and I didn't need to cry. The truth was a weapon, and now that I had it in my hands, I was going to use it to dismantle everything Lisa and Mike held dear. They thought they could use me as a scapegoat to bury their sins, but they had actually given me the keys to their destruction. I walked out of that precinct as the sun was hitting its peak, the bright light of a Wednesday morning revealing a world that looked exactly the same, yet was fundamentally broken. My marriage was dead, my trust was incinerated, but my mind was already racing through the legal and social avenues of retribution. I thought about the post-nuptial agreement Lisa had signed years ago, a document she probably thought was just a formality, and how it was about to become the instrument of her financial ruin. I thought about the medical board, the social circles, and the family legacy Mike was so desperate to protect. By the time I reached my car, I wasn't the victim of a frame job anymore. I was a man with a roadmap to justice, and I was going to follow it until every single person who had conspired against me was left with nothing but the consequences of their own choices. The drive home was silent, but my head was a roar of strategy, calculating the exact moment to strike so that when the hammer fell, there would be nothing left for them to salvage. Once the police cleared my name and realized Jeremy had just guessed it was me, because he was terrified of getting caught by the man who actually wielded the bat. I didn't scream, I didn't throw a fit, and I didn't give them the satisfaction of a public breakdown. I walked out of that precinct with a spine made of cold rolled steel, the morning sun hitting my face like a spotlight on a stage where the play had just taken a very dark turn. The drive home was a study in clinical observation. I noticed the way the wind moved through the trees and the way the morning traffic flowed, feeling like a ghost haunting the ruins of my own life. When I pulled into the driveway of the house I had painstakingly renovated, the sight of it didn't bring me warmth anymore. It looked like a crime scene where the evidence was hidden in the drywall and the floorboards. I walked through the front door, the silence of the foyer greeting me like a heavy shroud, and I went straight for the master bedroom. I didn't hesitate or linger over memories of shared mornings. I went to her closet, the one I had custom built for her with soft, close drawers and integrated lighting, and I began to strip it bare. I grabbed every single one of Lisa's designer bags, the Birkins, the Chanels, and the limited edition Pradas that I had bought her to celebrate anniversaries and promotions, and I began to pack them with a surgical efficiency. Each bag represented $1,000 of my hard work and 1,000 lies she had told while carrying them. I didn't just pack her clothes. I packed the identity she had built on my dime. I carried those bags, heavy with the weight of her vanity, down the stairs and sat them on the curb, lining them up in a neat, expensive row that looked like a high-end boutique had vomited onto the suburban pavement. Then I sat on the porch steps and waited, the neighborhood waking up around me, oblivious to the fact that a 12-year history was being liquidated in real time. I watched the clock on my phone, tracking the minutes until she would inevitably crawl back from the hospital, where she was comforting her boyfriend, the man whose blood was still probably being scrubbed off the motel parking lot. When her car finally turned the corner, she looked haggard, her eyes red-rimmed and her clothes rumpled, a far cry from the polished professional she pretended to be. She pulled into the driveway, her eyes widening as she saw the mountain of leather and silk sitting by the trash cans. She stepped out of the car, her voice already trembling as she tried to launch into a rehearsed monologue of grief and confusion. She tried to play the victim, crying about how Jeremy needed her, how he was broken and alone, and how she was only there out of a sense of misplaced compassion. She actually had the audacity to stand there, on the property I paid for, and tell me that her infidelity was a form of charity. She reached out to touch my arm, her face twisting into a mask of manufactured sorrow, but I stepped back as if her skin were made of acid. I didn't say a word as she rambled about misunderstandings and how Mike had overreacted, trying to pivot the blame onto her brother as if he hadn't been acting on the toxic secrets she had sown. When she finally ran out of breath, expecting me to argue or plead, I simply reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a manila envelope. I didn't give her a hug, and I didn't give her an explanation. I just handed her the post-nuptial agreement we had signed 3 years ago when I inherited my grandfather's estate. I remember the day we signed it. She had laughed and called it silly, saying she would never need it because we were forever. But she had signed it anyway because she wanted the immediate access to the trust fund for a kitchen remodel. That document was my ultimate shield, a legal masterpiece that I had insisted on with an engineer's foresight for structural failure. It was ironclad, specifically stating that in the event of documented infidelity, any assets derived from my inheritance, including the house, the primary savings accounts, and my entire retirement portfolio, would remain solely in my possession. As she flipped through the pages, the color drained from her face until she was the shade of unpainted drywall. The realization hit her like a physical blow. She wasn't just losing a husband. She was losing her entire lifestyle, her security, and her future. The agreement ensured she walked away with exactly 0% of my house, my savings, or my retirement funds, leaving her with nothing but her guilt and whatever she could fit into those designer bags on the sidewalk. She started to scream then, the victim mask slipping to reveal the jagged edges of a woman who had gambled everything and lost on a pair of deuces. She called me cold, she called me heartless, and she accused me of engineering her downfall as if I was the one who had checked into the sundown motel. I stood there, watching her unravel, and I felt nothing. No anger, no pity, just the profound satisfaction of a project completed to specifications. I told her she had 10 minutes to get the rest of her essentials before I called the locksmith, who was already on his way. She looked at the house, then at the bags, and finally at me, realizing for the first time that the man she thought she could manipulate was gone, replaced by someone who prioritized the math of justice over the mess of emotion. She began to scramble, frantically grabbing armloads of things. But the more she took, the more pathetic she looked, a scavenger in the ruins of a life she had set on fire. I watched her drive away with her car packed so full she could barely see out the rearview mirror, leaving behind a silence that was finally, for the first time in years, peaceful. I walked back inside, locked the door, and began the process of erasing every trace of her presence, knowing that the real work of my revenge was only just beginning. She thought the post-nup was the end of it, but she didn't realize that in my world, a solid foundation is just the beginning of the build. The real structure is what you do with the space you've cleared. I sat in my office, opened my laptop, and began drafting the first of several very important emails. The blue light of the screen reflecting in my eyes as I prepared to show Lisa and Jeremy that while the law might be finished with them, I certainly was not. Every click of the mouse felt like a hammer blow, every sentence a nail in the coffin of their reputations. They had tried to frame me for a felony to cover a fling, and now they were going to learn that when you try to bury an engineer, you'd better make sure he's actually dead, because otherwise, he's just going to find a way to turn the dirt into a fortress. I didn't stop at just kicking her out, because when you try to frame me for a felony and orchestrate a scenario where I spend my life behind bars for a crime I didn't commit, the gloves don't just come off. They are incinerated, and the bridges start burning with a heat that can be seen for miles. I spent the next 48 hours in a state of hyper-focused clarity, my engineer's brain treating the destruction of their reputations like a complex decommissioning project, where every bolt had to be removed and every support beam cut. I started with the professional sphere because Lisa had always valued her title and her standing at the clinic more than she valued our marriage, and I knew that her career was the armor she used to look down on everyone else. I made a few polite, measured phone calls to the state medical board and the respective HR departments of the healthcare group, where both she and Jeremy were employed, keeping my voice steady and clinical as I detailed exactly how a supposedly professional workplace relationship had devolved into a motel room circus that required a multi-agency police investigation. I didn't have to exaggerate or lie. I simply provided the case number, the names of the responding officers, and a summary of the incident that led to my wrongful arrest and Mike's subsequent detention. I spoke to an HR director named Diane, who went from professional politeness to a stunned, heavy silence as I described the assault, the infidelity on company time, and the attempt to subvert a criminal investigation. By the time I hung up, I knew the gears of corporate self-preservation were already turning. Lisa lost her career and her high-paying job in the same week, receiving a termination notice that cited ethical violations and conduct unbecoming of a medical professional, a blow that hit her harder than losing the house ever could have. But I wasn't finished with Jeremy either. He had tried to steal my freedom to save his own skin, and I felt it was only fair that he should experience the full weight of his choices at home. I tracked down his wife's contact information, a woman named Elena who had no idea that her husband's late nights at the office were actually spent in the neon glow of a seedy motel, and I invited her for a coffee that she would never forget. Seeing the look on her face when I laid out the timeline was a different kind of pain, but it was necessary. The real devastation came when we started looking into their shared finances. It turns out Jeremy hadn't just been unfaithful. He had been financially parasitic, spending their mortgage money and their children's college fund on secret getaways and expensive gifts for Lisa to keep the fantasy alive. Jeremy's wife didn't take the news too well either, and by the time I left that coffee shop, her lawyer was already on speed dial, and Jeremy's bags were being tossed into the same metaphorical gutter where he had tried to put me. There is a specific kind of justice in watching a liar lose their hiding spots, and I wanted to make sure Lisa had nowhere left to turn when the reality of her new life set in. I knew she was already working on a narrative for our mutual friends, a story where I was the controlling husband and she was the trapped woman who just made a mistake. So I decided to bypass her PR campaign entirely. I sat in my living room, the house finally quiet and smelling of the fresh air I'd let in, and I created a group text that included our entire social circle, college friends, neighbors, and even some of her distant cousins who had always looked up to her. I didn't add a long, emotional caption or beg for sympathy. I simply attached a digital copy of the police report, the one that clearly stated I was cleared of all charges and that Mike had been identified as the assailant in a dispute over Lisa's long-term affair. I hit send and watched as the read receipts began to pop up like little digital landmines, making sure there was nowhere left for her to hide her lies or play the role of the misunderstood wife. The silence that followed was broken only by the near-constant pinging of my phone as people reached out in shock, horror, and realization. The social architecture she had spent a decade building collapsed in a matter of seconds, leaving her isolated in the wreckage of her own making. It wasn't about being petty. It was about the truth being the only thing left standing when the smoke cleared. I watched as people who had stood at our wedding expressed their disgust, not just at the affair, but at the calculated cruelty of trying to send an innocent man to prison. By Friday, Lisa was a pariah in the town she once thought she owned, a woman with no job, no husband, no house, and a reputation that was permanently stained by the black ink of a police report. Every time I thought about the cold steel of those handcuffs on my wrists, I felt a renewed sense of purpose in ensuring that the consequences for her actions were absolute and irreversible. She had tried to delete me from my own life, so I simply ensured that the life she tried to steal no longer existed for her to enjoy. I sat on my porch that evening, watching the sunset and feeling the strange, hollow peace of a man who has finished a war he never wanted to start. The bridges were all gone now, reduced to ash and floating away on the wind, and as I looked at the empty space where my marriage used to be, I realized that I wasn't mourning a loss anymore. I was celebrating a liberation. The masterclass was almost complete, and while the fire was still smoldering in the distance, I was already looking forward to the quiet that comes after the storm. A year later, my life looks like a complete 180 from that nightmare night, a transformation so profound that the memory of those flickering police lights and the cold snap of handcuffs feels like a scene from a movie I watched a lifetime ago, rather than a reality I actually lived through. The chaos that once threatened to swallow me whole has been replaced by a quiet, rhythmic stability that I built with the same precision I apply to my structural designs, and the result is a life that is sturdier and more beautiful than the one I lost. I recently secured a massive promotion at the firm, stepping into a senior partner role that has me overseeing the most ambitious infrastructure projects in the state. A position that came not just from my technical skills, but from a level of unshakable focus I developed while the world was trying to tear me down. My colleagues see a man who is disciplined, calm, and utterly in control, never suspecting that my professional ascent was fueled by the cold clarity of a man who had his foundation tested and found it wouldn't break. This new chapter has brought a financial freedom that allows me to enjoy the finer things without a hint of guilt or the need to check a joint bank account for mysterious withdrawals. Physically, I've undergone a metamorphosis of my own, hitting a new PR in the gym that has me feeling like I'm 20 again, with a level of energy and strength that makes the dad bod of my marriage feel like a heavy, discarded costume. Every morning at 5 a.m., the cold iron of the weights serves as a reminder that you can always rebuild. That muscle is forged through tension, and that I am stronger now than I ever was when I was carrying the weight of Lisa's lies. I'm currently dating a woman named Maya, who actually knows the meaning of the word loyalty. A woman whose honesty is so refreshing that it feels like breathing mountain air after years of inhaling thick, toxic smoke. We spend our weekends hiking through the trails of the Pacific Northwest, or cooking quiet dinners where the only drama is whether we should open a second bottle of wine, and the peace of mind she provides is a luxury I didn't even know I was missing. It's a relationship built on mutual respect and transparent communication, a stark contrast to the motel room circus and the gaslighting that defined the end of my marriage. While my world expanded, the world of those who betrayed me shrank until it became a claustrophobic cage of their own making. Lisa is reportedly bouncing between the couches of the few acquaintances who haven't blocked her yet. Her life a frantic scramble for a stability she once took for granted. She's working a dead-end retail job at a local mall just to keep the lights on. The woman who used to carry $3,000 handbags now scanning barcodes and folding shirts for minimum wage while trying to ignore the whispers of people who recognize her from the police reports. I've heard she spends her breaks checking my social media from burner accounts, watching me thrive from the shadows of her own failure, and realizing too late that she didn't just lose a husband. Elle lost the only person who would have actually stood by her if she'd been honest. Jeremy is broke and alone, a hollow shell of the man who thought he could steal another man's life. His wife, Elena, took him for everything he had in the divorce, leaving him with nothing but his medical bills and a reputation so toxic that no reputable clinic will even look at his resume. He's a pariah in the professional community, a cautionary tale told to new interns about the cost of mixing predatory behavior with professional misconduct. As for Mike, he's currently sitting in a cell in a state correctional facility, thinking about his life choices and the family honor he tried to protect with a baseball bat. The justice system eventually caught up with his violent impulses, and now he has years of cold, gray walls to contemplate the fact that his sister's affair wasn't worth his freedom. I don't feel joy in their suffering. That would mean I still gave them power over my emotions. But I do feel a profound sense of cosmic balance, the satisfaction of seeing the math of the universe finally add up. I'm sitting on my porch this evening, the same porch where I once waited for Lisa to come home from the motel. But now the air is clear and the silence is a gift. I'm enjoying a quiet glass of expensive bourbon, the amber liquid catching the last of the golden hour sun as I look out over the yard I've reclaimed. The best way to destroy someone who betrayed you isn't to stay angry or to plot their demise. It's to become so undeniably successful and genuinely happy that their entire existence becomes nothing more than a funny story you tell at dinner parties, a brief footnote in a much grander narrative of resilience. The anger is gone, replaced by a deep, immovable peace, and as I take a sip of the bourbon, I realize that the fire they started didn't consume me. It just burned away everything that wasn't real, leaving only the man I was always meant to be. I hit the block button on the last of Lisa's desperate messages months ago, and as the screen went dark, I knew that the story was finally finished. I am the architect of my own future now, and the view from the top is better than I ever imagined it could be.